Okay, welcome to the video. I'm doing something a bit different today, and because of that, this video needs a little bit of an introduction. So far, with my sort of resurrection of this channel, I've focused on issues to do with, basically issues to do with the law of negligence. In fact, even particular issues to do with economic loss in the law of negligence. And the reason for that is that's really, I suppose, the area where people who know me at all are most familiar with my work. So I thought I'd sort of start from a strength and build out. Though I think that was probably a mistake now, because I don't think all that many people are really interested in the law stuff. So it may have been better to start with something else. And I'm just giving that a go today. Now, this relates to a course that I'm currently teaching at the university that I teach at. I'm teaching a course called Democracy, Law and Political Conflict. So it's a course about political conflict, right? And because it's a course about political conflict and it's being taught at the moment, unsurprisingly, the United States is a subject that keeps coming up. And I wanted to talk, because it keeps coming up, this is something, what I'm talking about today is something that I wanted to talk about with the students in that course. It's just that it's not exactly on the topics that we're looking at, and it would take me a while to do, and I'm under a little bit of time pressure at the moment. So instead of talking about it in class, I thought that I would I'd make a video about it and let the students who were interested watch that video. But then, of course, I thought, well, if I'm making a video on it, why don't I put it on this channel, right? So that anyone who's interested in it can have a look at it. Okay, so that's the point of this video. And I'd actually like to do more of this stuff in the future. I don't want my channel to be solely about law. I want it to be about, as well, the name of the channel is Law, Life and Everything, right? And I do want it to be about many other things other than law. So this is the first time that I'm giving that a go. Okay, so I hope you find this interesting. Now, the point of this video is to explain something about about what we're seeing with the Trump administration. I'm not going to tell you what I think about. Well, there's a little bit at the end where I talk a little bit about my own views, but I just want to explain something that I think is not well understood or not well explained in, let's just say, the mainstream media. Of course, if you know me, you'll know that I think that almost nothing is explained well in the mainstream media. So there's no great surprise that this won't be explained well in the mainstream media. But there's a certain a set of ideas that are important to understanding what's going on in the United States with the Trump administration, and I think this will be, this is just a helpful way of thinking about those things. Now, the key figure here is an academic, a political philosopher called Leo Strauss, who's dead now. He died in 1973. He was born in 1899 and died in 1973. He was a German. He was born to Jewish parents in Germany, and unsurprisingly, as a result, fled Germany in the lead up to the Second World War. Fled to the United States, and Strauss became an academic at the University of Chicago in the United States. I'll just turn off this sound. And he wrote a number of important books, and has had a very big influence on, particularly, but not only, I'll talk about this in a minute, but particularly, but not only, the political right in the United States. So a very significant figure. Now, one of the odd things about Strauss, for example, I recently reread his which I can't remember the name of now. I'll put it up on the screen here, and you can see it's something natural right something. Anyway, it just slipped my memory. There it is. You will, as it were, see it before me, if you see what I mean. He wrote this book. So as I say, I recently reread this book, and it's not really clear from when you read it what it is that he's saying in this book. He seems to be saying things like, I think the most important message would be that, we used to believe, people in the West used to believe in an objective morality, and we used to believe that our societies, to a greater or lesser extent, but we were at least trying to instantiate the objective morality. And we've lost faith in this idea in the last, let's say, 50 years, maybe 100 years, whatever it is. We've lost faith in this idea, and that was a big mistake. It was a big mistake to lose faith in the idea of an objective morality, and it was a big mistake to lose the faith in the idea that we were at least progressing towards the realization of this objective morality in our societies. Okay, so that on the face of it, that's his central claim, and it's not a particular. I mean, it's controversial in the sense that there'll be people who disagree with it, obviously, but it's not the kind of thing that you would expect to engender a huge amount of political controversy in the real world, as people say. Right, but it has engendered a huge amount of political controversy in the real world, actually, and that Strauss has inspired two political movements in the United States that are very much focused on the real world. Now, as I say, the odd thing about Strauss is that you read him and if you're just reading it at face value, it doesn't seem to be all that controversial. It doesn't seem to be it's not the kind of thing that's going to make people angry or get people upset. There are, as a result of the problem is that Strauss always seems to be kind of hiding. That is, there seems to be another message there, right? It's as if he's telling us the stuff on the surface is just there on the surface, but there's a hidden message. And one of the reasons for thinking that is that Strauss actually tells us that philosophers tend to hide their deep meanings, and that they're right to do so, because if they don't hide their deep meanings, they will be persecuted. And one might think of Socrates in this context, who, of course, didn't hide the deep... I mean, Socrates would have denied that there was a deep meaning, I suppose, in his philosophy. But I mean, Socrates just went out there, right, and said what he thought, or he just asked the questions that he thought needed to be asked, and he ended up getting executed. Well, he ended up being tried and put to... And the death penalty was imposed on him, although, of course, as we know, he wasn't really supposed to undergo the death penalty. He was supposed to escape into exile, but chose to undergo the death penalty himself. But anyway, the idea is that philosophers who really speak their minds openly get persecuted, and so the idea is that here is Strauss saying what he thinks, but he's not openly speaking his mind. He's hiding his deep message. And as a result of this, people who read Strauss think, all right, okay, so my job is to discover the deep message that's hidden in Strauss's work. Okay, now, in this regard, there are two major schools of thought that have grown up around the interpretation of Leo Strauss's political philosophy. And these two groups are called West Coast and East Coast Straussians. The West Coast Straussians, they're called West Coast Straussians because they're based at Claremont McKenna College, which is in California. And the East Coast Straussians are called East Coast Straussians because they tend to be from the East. I mean, for example, Alan Bloom, who was one of Leo Strauss's students, at least ended up at Yale. Okay, Alan Bloom is the guy who wrote this very famous book, The Closing of the American Mind. Okay, so there are the West and East Coast Straussians, right? And they have a different interpretation of Strauss's view, and as a result, they have a different political philosophy themselves. Now, let's start with the East Coast Straussians, right? Now, the East Coast Straussians are sometimes called neoconservatives, although some of them don't like that name. But that's often a name that's applied to them, neoconservatives. They're often sometimes called liberal internationalists. Let's not worry too much about labels, right? This is just what they're called, right? And they might not like it, but who gives a stuff, right? That's what they're called. And that will do for our purposes today. I mean, if we were doing a 5-hour investigation of this, we might need to talk about this in more detail, but this will do for today. Now, these people include, and Strauss's students, or students of Strauss's and students of Strauss's students, yes, and involve some very high-profile figures in the U.S. government. Now, when the people are talked about, this tends to be associated with the Republican. There tends to be an association between this school of thought and the Republican Party, but that strikes me as actually wrong. There is, of course, a connection between this mode of thought and the Republican Party. I mean, a classic example is Paul Wolfowitz, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense under oh God, I'm going to forget. Donald Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense, and Bush, George Bush, God, I couldn't believe I forgot that. George W. Bush was the president. Okay, so there are a number of people. Another example is Robert Kagan, who's an academic, but was associated with the Republican. He's since left the Republican Party, and for reasons that we'll talk about in a sec, that are very important to this discussion, but he was closely associated with the Republicans. But it's really important to recognise that although there is a very strong connection between East Coast Straussianism and the Republican Party, East Coast Straussianism is very strong within the Democratic Party as well. And very strong in particular amongst the upper echelons of the Democratic Party. That is the people in the Democratic Party who tend to come into power when there's a Democratic president. Okay, so a good example of this would be Robert Kagan is married. I'm not sort of sure if he's still alive or they're still married. Anyway, who cares? But he was certainly at the time I'm going to talk about married to a woman called Victoria Nuland, a rather infamous figure in the US government who has played various roles under both Republican and Democratic administrations, but is particularly associated with Democratic institutions. She's somewhat infamous because she's the person who made this famous phone call to the ambassador in Ukraine in the immediate aftermath of the overthrow of, or was it just before? Whatever it was, the overthrow of Yanukovych, the Ukrainian president. And this has one way or another, right? We can investigate this on another occasion, resulted in the current Ukrainian war. So, and I think really the classic statement of sort of real world East Coast republicanism was actually made by a Democrat, by a woman called Madeleine Albright, who was who was Clinton's Secretary of State, which we'll get onto in a sec. So this East Coast Straussian neoconservatism, liberal internationalism, whatever you want to call it, it seems to me to be it's part of the American government. It's part of the establishment Republicans. Now there's an important rider there, right? Establishment Republicans, and it's part of the Democrats. Maybe not. It's not all Democrats believe it, certainly, but it's at the upper echelons of the Democratic Party. It was Biden's view. It was Obama's view. It was Clinton's view. It was right. It's just the same as it was Bush's view, and so on. Okay, now what is the essence of East Coast republicanism, East Coast Straussianism? Okay, the essence of East Coast Straussianism is the view that the American political system is the greatest political system that has ever been produced by some distance, and it is, if not perfect, because of course it's not perfect, but it is on the road to realising the objective moral, to realising the objective morality that we were talking about earlier. So, of all the world's political systems, the United States, the political system of the United States stands head and shoulders above the political systems of other countries. And what's more, when it comes to foreign policy, the idea that's often enunciated by East Coast Straussians is that, although of course it's not perfect, American foreign policy gets much closer to a moral foreign policy than the foreign policy of any other country in history. That's the view. Okay, and so the idea then is that what the United States ought to be doing is exporting its political system to other countries around the world. And and if that means exporting it via the barrel of a gun, well, that's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do because it will make the societies that are forced to adopt an American-style political system will be benefited by that, and the United States in turn will be benefited by that. Everyone will be benefited by that, except the bad guys, of course. And so that is the right thing to do. Okay? So that's that's what's sometimes called neoconservatism or liberal internationalism, right? And this is the idea. We have, I mean, it's not perfect, the system that I'm speaking now as one of these people. We have a system that's not perfect, but it's much closer to the objective moral truth than any other system. And our job, therefore, is to go around exporting this system to other peoples of the world. And I mean, people like Condoleezza Rice under Bush and so forth were adherents of Donald Rumsfeld and others were adherents of this view. But then again, I want to stress it's not just the Republicans that were adherents of this view. This has been American policy for forever, right? I mean, you could argue it's not quite fair, I think, to say since the end of the Second World War, but certainly since the end of the Cold War. It has been American policy, no matter who's president, except for one person, right? That we're going to get to in a sec. Now, I said that the leading real-world statement of East Coast Straussianism was made by a woman called Madeleine Albright, who was Clinton's Secretary of State. And she made this statement during a time where it looked like the United States might get involved in a war in Iraq, of course, not for the first time, but they looked like they were going to get involved in a war with Iraq, and she was asked in an interview on television, what's your justification for this war? What's your justification for getting involved in the war? And this was her answer. She said, "If we have to use force, it is because we are America. We are the indispensable nation. We stand tall and we see further than other countries into the future." Okay, so here's the idea, right? On this view, we are the indispensable. I mean, this is not me, right? I'm a Kiwi, right? We are the indispensable nation. America is the indispensable nation. It has the view, it has the system that is closest to the objective moral truth, and it's the only country in history that's actually tried to implement the moral truth in its foreign policy. Now, it doesn't just act in accordance with its self-interest. It's uniquely moral in its foreign policy. Now, you might think this is a load of crap. I think this is a load of crap, but this is what these people believe, right? Or at least what they like to pretend to themselves that they believe. Okay, so that's the idea, right? We are the indispensable nation, right? Everyone else just acts in their own self-interest, but we don't. We follow the moral truth. We are indispensable. And what's more, we stand taller than anybody else. We see further than everybody else. We understand the world better than anybody else. So what this means, right, according to this position, is that everyone else in the world should listen to us, but we don't need to listen to them, right? Because why don't we need to listen to them? Well, because we already stand taller than them. We already see further than they do, right? We are the indispensable nation. We don't need to listen to you. You need to listen to us. We are indispensable. We stand taller. We see further. Okay, that's the view. Okay, now, as I said, that's that view, this understanding of politics in general, has dominated in the United States. Republicans and Democrat administrations, there may be people in the House of Representatives or whatever who don't agree with this, but Republican and Democrat administrations, at least since the end of the Cold War. Now, who on this view, according to the East Coast Straussians, according to the neoconservatives, according to the liberal internationalists, who's the enemy? Right now, of course, the enemy might be all the bad regimes in the world. Okay, but there's another enemy that's really important here, and that is the domestic enemy, the enemy at home, the enemy in the United States. Now, who are they? Or basically, you might describe them, broadly speaking, as the left, right? And they are the people who say, you know what? We don't have a great political system. We're not the leaders of the world when it comes to morality. We don't have a moral foreign policy. We're just the same as everybody else, or maybe even worse than everybody else. Or maybe there is no such thing as a moral foreign policy, or there is no such thing as objective morality, or whatever. All those people, right? All those people on the left. And the position of the East Coast Straussians with respect to all those people is we just have to stop listening to them, right? These people are sapping our confidence, right? The right thing to do is to have confidence in our values and to go out there in the world and impose those values for the good of everybody, right? Yes, there are a whole lot of people in the United States who are undermining this project, and we need to stop listening to them, right? They are wrecking things, right? Because they are undermining our confidence. Right? We need to ignore them and to move on in our moral mission. One doesn't want to use the word crusade, but that's what it is. Okay, all right. That's all I want to say about the East Coast Straussians for the moment. Now, I want now to turn to the West Coast Straussians. Now, the West Coast Straussians have a similar view to the East Coast Straussians. Not surprising, right? They read the same books, right? They came up with very similar ideas, but there are some important differences. Okay, what are these differences? Well, I think the way to get at the main difference is to start by talking about the enemy. Right, so we're here focusing on the domestic enemy. So we saw with the the East Coast Straussians, the domestic enemy. The problem was that the domestic enemy was undermining the self-confidence of the United States, and so thwarting its mission, its global mission. Okay, now the West Coast Straussians have a different view about the enemy. They think the enemy are the same people, but they think that the enemy is more powerful and has had more influence than the East Coast Straussians do. Okay, so in particular, I think the problem is not just that there are these people out there who are undermining our self-confidence and who are having influence that we wish they didn't have. The problem is that these people, right, the people who are opposed to the values that we believe in, these people have infiltrated, notice this terminology, right, have infiltrated the institutions of government and the institutions of civil society, so that the problem that we have now is not just that we're listening to people who we shouldn't be listening to. The problem is that the system itself has become corrupted, right? And so something needs to be done to undo the corruption of the system. Okay, so let me just give you some examples of this. So one might think, for example, that the problem is that these bad left ideas are not just out there in the world and people are saying them and we're spending too much time listening to them. No, it's that the judiciary has been captured by these ways of thinking. Okay? Now, if you believe that the judiciary has been captured by those ways of thinking, you've got a problem, right? Because it means now that it becomes very difficult to trust or rely on the law anymore, right? Another example, the media, right? The claim is the media has been infiltrated by these ways of thinking, and so the media is now telling you lies. The media is lying to you. The media is giving you a biased view of the world. So you can't rely on the media anymore. universities. Right? The universities are full of academics who have bought into this or have been indoctrinated into these ways of thinking, right? So you can't rely on the universities to provide what we in New Zealand would call the critic and conscience of society. The universities aren't the critic and conscience of society anymore. They're just purveyors of a particular particular political agenda. Okay, now the significance of this, right, is that on this view, on the West Coast Straussian view, that the way to respond to the enemy is not simply, or cannot simply be, to assert the values of the system. Rather, the system is broken. And what you have to do is find a way of repairing the system, right? So for the East Coast Straussians, the American system is brilliant, and what you need to do is take the American system and impose it on the rest of the world, right? For the East Coast Republicans, the American system is brilliant in principle, right? The problem is that it's been infiltrated by all these people who are wrecking it, and so you have to find a way of repairing the system. Now, how can you repair the system? Right, well, a slogan for capturing this might be to say that in order to save the system, you have to break it. Okay, and that might sound like a contradiction, and it may even be a contradiction, but that's the idea, right? In order to save the system, you have to break it. So you might, for example, you might believe in the rule of law, right? But the problem is that if you live in a society where you think that the judiciary is bias against you because they've adopted all of these horrible ideas, you can't rely on the rule of law now, right? So you have to break the rule. And what's more, you might well think that the judiciary actually doesn't believe in the rule of law anymore either. I mean, that's actually something that I believe. I believe that belief in the rule of law amongst the judiciary, despite what they say, is actually quite low, right? I mean, I'm not a West Coast Straussian, but I happen to think that there's some truth in this idea, right? Anyway, that's also for another topic, another talk. But the point is that you can't just say, well, we can rely on the judges to uphold the rule of law if you just think that they've been so inundated with and believe in terrible ideas that mean that they themselves don't believe in the rule of law. So what have you got to do? You've got to break the rule of law in order to save it, right? You've got to get rid of the judges or do something radical in order to save the rule of law, right? You've got to save the rule of law from the judiciary. Okay? For example, right now, if you believe that the media is biased against you, and the media has been infiltrated by all these terrible ideas. Now, you might nevertheless believe in freedom of the press, freedom of the media, freedom of speech, and so on. But you think that if you just adhere to those principles, you're just going to perpetuate the problem. So you have to break freedom of the press in order to save it. Right? Can you see? I hope you can see these ideas, right? Right. You might believe in the freedom of academic freedom in universities, but if the universities have been captured by a political agenda that is itself undermining academic freedom, the only way to save academic freedom is to break it. Right? You have to break it and then recreate it again. Right? Because leaving it to university professors and so on is not going to get you anywhere, because academic freedom has been destroyed in the universities. Okay, so you have to break the system in order to save it. That's the idea. Now, I've got 4 real-world examples of this that I want to talk to you about. Now, as is usually the case, the real-world examples aren't as clear-cut as they ideally would be, but I think nevertheless they serve for our purposes. So the first one I want to talk about is the arrest of the was it University of Columbia student Muhammad Khalil, really right at the beginning, or very close to the beginning of Trump's presidency. Now, one thing to say here before I talk about that in detail is what's the relationship, you might be asking now, between West Coast Straussianism and the Trump administration? And I want to say this. West Coast Straussian ideas are very prevalent in the Trump administration, though it would be no means right to say that it's simply, Trump is a West Coast Straussian. I don't think Trump has any particular political philosophy. And there are people in the administration who aren't West Coast Straussians. I think Marco Rubio would be one, who I think is just a straightforward neoconservative. He's an East Coast Straussian, but nevertheless, East Coast Straussian ideas are very prevalent. West Coast Straussian ideas are very prevalent in the Trump administration. Whether they know where they come from or not, I don't know. But nevertheless, the ideas are very prevalent in the in the Trump administration. Now, the West Coast Straussians themselves tend to support Trump, although they're not all that keen on the guy as a general rule, right? They just see him as the best of a bad bunch, right? But anyway, so there's a link there. Now, let's get back to Khalil. So Khalil was arrested. Now, if you read the newspaper, it'll tell you that he was arrested for supporting Hamas. But that's actually not what's on his charge sheet, right? He was not charged with supporting Hamas. He was never charged with that. He was charged. In fact, he wasn't charged with any criminal offence at all. It was what happened is that they arrested him at the idea that they were going to remove his student visa and then remove him from the country on the basis that he had no legal entitlement to be in the country. But then it turned out that he was a legal permanent resident, and it all became very difficult. But the key thing I want to focus on, there's a lot here that one could focus on, but the key thing I want to focus on is that they arrested him. He was arrested in New York or in New Jersey. I can't remember. Maybe New Jersey, because that's where the litigation... Anyway, whatever. He was arrested in the north and taken to Louisiana, right? And there were hearings held in Louisiana. Now, on the face of it, that is a direct violation of the U.S. Constitution, because in both in the Sixth Amendment, but also in Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution, it says that the hearing must take place in the district in which the alleged offence was committed. Now, you can fudge this. This is why it's never as clear as, the real world cases are never as clear as I would like them to be as a theorist. You can fudge this to say, yeah, but he never was charged with a criminal offence, so it's not inconsistent with the Constitution. And maybe you could argue this, but the fact is that the Constitution seems clearly to say that the hearing should not have been in Louisiana. The hearing, he should never have been taken to Louisiana, right, and put before a judge in Louisiana. He should have been put before a judge in the district in which his alleged wrongdoing took place. Okay, which would have meant that he would have been heard by a judge in New York, or as it actually turned out, a judge in New Jersey got involved. Now, why did they send him to Louisiana? Well, the answer is judges in Louisiana are much more conservative than judges in New York or New Jersey. All right, and so the administration felt that it was going to have a much easier hearing with the judge in Louisiana than with the judge in New York or New Jersey. Now, that is precisely what the Constitution is designed to prevent. Now, the reason that those clauses are in the Constitution is because during the American War of Independence, the British would arrest people and before the War of Independence, the British would arrest people and then sort of ship them to London to be tried, right? And obviously people a jury in London were more sympathetic to the British position than a jury in Virginia or wherever. And the American colonists thought that this was outrageous. So when they became independent, they stuck this in the Constitution. So it's in the Constitution to prevent precisely this kind of thing. It's to prevent the administration, to prevent the executive from forum shopping, right? That's why it's there, right? But nevertheless, Khalil was taken and rendered to Louisiana and put on trial. Okay, as apparently in deliberate violation of the Constitution. And another example would be the sending in of the National Guard into various cities in the United States. Now, on the face of it, that appears to be a violation of the rights of states within the Constitution. And the curious thing here, the really interesting thing here, is conservatives tend to be very much in favour of states' rights. And yet, right here we have a conservative administration, on the face of it, violating states' rights by sending agents of the federal government into American cities and to do what they've been doing, right? Okay, so that on the face of it, that looks like not just to be a violation of the articles of the Constitution, but an interesting one in that it's a violation that would normally very much upset conservatives, right? It's the kind of thing that really would upset East Coast Straussians, right? They would be very upset about that, and indeed are very upset about the Trump administration's behaviour in this regard. Okay, another one is the ICE officers, the immigration officers, wearing masks and sometimes arresting people that they know are American citizens, right? They have no authority to arrest. These immigration officials have no authority, no legal authority to arrest American citizens, but sometimes they do. They just do, and nobody seems to be particular. I mean, there might be some crocodile tears shed in the Trump administration about that, but nobody seems particularly bothered by that. And another example, the last example I'll talk about, is Trump's imposition of tariffs. Now, Trump has just imposed tariffs himself. He just, okay, here, I'm going to make up this regular. But in the Constitution, tariffs are a tax, and it says in the Constitution that only Congress can impose tax, but nobody has asked Congress. Now, again, there's a way around this. It's not quite as perfect for theoretical purposes as we would like, because you can say, well, there's a piece of legislation that says that the president can impose tariffs if there's an emergency situation, and Trump's actually claimed that there's an emergency situation. The problem is that the emergency situation that Trump points to is a balance of payments problem, and this balance of payments problem has been around since basically the end of the Second World War, so it's a strange kind of emergency, right, that's been going on for nearly 100 years, but okay, so the case isn't quite perfect. But anyway, the point I want to make, the key point I want to make is this, but the real world's always messy, right, but the key point I want to make is this. Okay, on one interpretation of what's going on here, Trump, which I think is the wrong interpretation, right, the Trump administration just doesn't get it. It doesn't understand the American political system, and it's wrecking it without understanding what they're doing, and it's just, this is all terrible, but I think this is wrong. What's happening is the Trump administration is deliberately violating constitutional norms, and they're doing it because they think that the only way to save the Constitution is to break it, right, in the way I was explaining earlier. So, for example, they think that the United States has become awash with illegal immigrants who are destroying the basis of the political system in the country. And if they try and play by the rules, there'll be no saving the political system, because it's too late. There'd be too much of an influx of too many immigrants already here, and what's more, there's a left-leaning judiciary that's going to be very sympathetic when their cases come before the courts, and so on and so on, and the media is going to be on their side, and so the only way to save the political system is to break it, right? You have to illegally deport people, right, in order to have the rule of law back again eventually, right? Because the alternative is the system is wrecked, and it's just going to keep on wrecking itself, because we've got the wrong people in positions of power, we've got people with the wrong ideas, and so on and so forth. Right, that's the view. Okay, so the reason, it's not an accident that these things are happening, right? It's not an accident that, take, for example, the guy whose name I can't remember that was wrongly extradited to, if you can call it extradited, to El Salvador. And, the Trump administration seemed to recognise that he'd been wrongly sent there, and just didn't really seem to give a damn. Why? Well, they are deliberately flouting the legal norms, right? Because they see this as the only way to save the system. Now, so far I haven't said anything about, I've said a few little things about what I think about all of this. But I don't want that's not the message of this video. There's a couple of things I need to say now that are more along the lines of what I think. But I haven't said, I might as well just tell you I'm not a Straussian, right? East or West Coast, right? But so I'm not endorsing any of this. I'm just trying to explain it to you so that you can see why, you get some sort of insight as to why the things that are happening are happening. Why is this happening? Why are these things keep on happening all the time? Well, I think this certainly is a reason that helps me understand why these things have been happening. Okay, now just a couple of things that I want to say about the West Coast Straussian view before I finish, and that is that it's a very dangerous thing to do for two main reasons. One is when you do this, even if everything else they say is right, which I'm not endorsing, I'm not criticizing either. That's for another time, right? To express my position on all of this. But even if you think that everything that the West Coast Straussians believe is correct, the idea of breaking something in order to save it is very dangerous, because when you break something, you create weapons that other people can use. So even if you're right, even if your goals are correct, when you break something, you create a weapon that people that you think are wrong can use. And a really good example of this, though it goes the other way, is the Trump administration's at least threat at the moment to use hate speech laws. So that hate speech laws are introduced in order to protect minorities. So that's the idea, right? And but now that Charlie Kirk has been murdered, the Trump administration is starting to say, well, we can use hate speech laws in order to prevent you saying things that are critical of us. I mean, after all, this is obviously you hate us, as Trump said to that reporter the other day. Obviously you hate us, and what's more, I mean, we don't really have to argue, do we, that this hate can lead to harm? I mean, after all, Kirk got murdered, right? So here's a case where the left created weapons that the right is now using. Now, what I'm saying is that the right is now creating weapons that the left or whoever might end up using in the future. So it's very dangerous to do this, right? When you break something in order to save something, you create weapons that your opponents can use. And it's kind of naive to think that only you will be able to use those weapons. So, the idea that, you can break the rule of law as long as you're doing what I want you to do, right, is just naive, because once you start, as we lawyers say, once you establish a precedent of breaking the rule of law, the people, your opponents, are going to break the rule of law too, right? Now, this is connected to the next point I want to make, and that is, if you think that, put it the other way around. The idea of breaking a political system in order to save it, it seems to me, can make sense only if you think that political systems are quite robust things, right? So you can sort of smash into it, and it's going to, it's going to be dented and damaged a bit, cracked a bit, but it's resilient, and it can be rebuilt. You can repair the cracks and knock out the dents with not too much trouble. But if you think that political systems are actually quite fragile things, then the idea of breaking in order to save something won't appeal to you at all, because you really start cracking, put a few dents and put a few cracks, and the whole thing could just fall to pieces. Right now, I think that political systems are fragile. Now, I know that we don't experience them that way. We experience them as robust because it's very difficult intentionally to change them. But I think what history shows is that the political systems can fall apart at the drop of a hat. If you look at societies that have fallen apart, generally speaking, nobody predicted that it was going to happen. And nobody knew what the event was. The event happened, and no one thought it was a big deal. And then that event caused the society to collapse. And it's only when you look back in hindsight that you think, oh yeah, that event was really significant. At the time, nobody thought it was a big deal. So The danger here is if you're trying to break a political system in order to fix it, you might just break the political system, right? And I think that's not unlikely to happen in this case. Anyway, that's enough from me. I hope you found, this is longer than I would normally go by some distance, but I hope you found these ideas useful, at least, for interpreting what's going on in the United States and perhaps not only in the United States. Cheers. See you next time.